Hey everyone, and welcome to this first lecture on practical theology. The focus of this lecture is to give a broad perspective on what we mean when we talk about practical theology. Sometimes when I say that I teach practical theology, people automatically assume it means just learning like techniques, what I often refer to as kind of the hyper-practical, but it doesn't really mean that. Practical theology is the place where theological reflection, whether through scripture, historical theology, philosophical theology, systematic theology, really meets the needs of people in a congregation or a community. So what a practical theologian is doing is interpreting both the tradition, both the message of revelation and the community and the individual or the problem that you're trying to address. And so as we think about practical theology, we want to begin by really better understanding what the task of practical theology is about. So when we think about theology, there are different forms. There's systematic theology that talks about doctrine. It looks at the biblical revelation and then it asks questions about God, humanity, a theological anthropology, the nature of sin, salvation, and begins to put language to what we mean when we talk about salvation or total depravity and those types of things. Biblical theology focuses on Scripture, the interpretation of Scripture, but then also applying that to the life of an individual or the life of a community. What does it mean for us today? Historical theology focuses more on the trajectory of theological thought and how it is developed. So when we talk about the early church, how do we get from the early church in Corinth and Thessalonica and all of those places where Paul is writing his letters and the gospel writers all the way here to the 21st century and some of the theological developments that have happened in the history of Christianity. And so historical theology wants to explore those developments. Philosophical theology is asking kind of deeper questions about the relationship between philosophy, theology, and Scripture. And how do we know what is revelation? Developing an epistemology, which is a fancy word for talking about knowledge and how we know anything. And then finally, practical theology is focused on an engagement of a community. It really is addressing specific problems. So when you think about a pastor in a congregation, they're doing a lot of these things. They're doing biblical theology, maybe they're doing philosophical theology. So all of these things kind of mesh together. They're not all siloed out and separated. They operate like concentric circles. But then a pastor in a congregation comes up against problems and issues that people are dealing with. And the task of practical theology is to ask questions about, number one, what is happening? How do we make sense of what is happening? And then how do we find a way forward? And how do we draw from Scripture, theology to provide a way forward? And one of the words we're going to keep coming back to is transformation. How do we bring people out of old patterns of action and thought that have caused them to be stuck or are causing problems into a different way of life? And that is what practical theology focuses on. In that way, practical theology, I see it as where the rubber hits the road. It's always asking questions about what it means for a particular community. It's asking what's at stake for a particular community in the way that they hold their beliefs, the way they practice their beliefs, and just how they live as a community. So one of the things that I want to focus on in this first lecture is to think about the relationship between revelation and culture. And this is very simplistic, so I understand we're narrowing it way down, and so it's much more complicated and messy than the way I'm going to describe it. But I think it's important for us just to begin this conversation. So you see there, I have the Bible representing revelation, theology, revelation of God in Scripture. And then we have human culture on the other side. We have human experience. So I could have also put human experience on this other side. And this is the world in which we live. This is the world of biology, of politics, technology, family. And the question is, what is the relationship between these two things? And how do we understand the relationship between the revelation of God in Jesus Christ and the cultural world that we live in and inhabit? And how do they communicate? And which one takes priority? That is, I think, an important question for us to wrestle with. Now, I personally find the labels conservative and liberal to be problematic. But for our purposes, I'm going to use them. And I don't mean them negatively or positively here. I'm simply referring to a posture or a way in which a community tends to lead and what they tend to fall back on as they think about the relationship between revelation and culture. In conservative communities, the emphasis is upon revelation. And so some of you who are within conservative communities probably hear people constantly ask, well, what does the Bible say about this, that, and the other thing? And that we should be getting back to biblical principles that then should guide the way that we think about culture and the way that we live in culture. So you can see the arrows are very much directed from the Bible, theology, revelation, the church, a lot of other words we could put in there, towards culture. In other words, the revelation side is privileged over culture. So on the conservative side, anytime there's an issue, that they're going to go back to looking at what does the Bible say, what does the tradition say, and then use that as a way to say, well, now this is how we should act, or this is what we need to do. They're less likely to say, hey, culture has changed. We have a different understanding of what it means to be human. We understand gender differently, for example, and maybe that should influence how we read the Bible. They're not going to approach it that way. The arrows are going to go from the Bible to culture. I need to make something clear. On the conservative side, they do value culture and so on and so forth. So we're not saying that they don't take seriously some of the things that happen in culture, but what they're doing is they're privileging the revelation side over that cultural side. On the liberal side, again, they believe in the Bible, they believe in the revelation of God in Jesus and theology, and believe that's very important. But they're also much more attuned to the cultural side. And so they look at cultural developments that are happening and want to say, well, maybe this should influence the way we read Scripture or understand revelation. Does it change the way we understand the Bible? Now, what I want to suggest to you here is that there's a better way to think about this, that it doesn't have to be conservative or liberal, but there can be a way in which Scripture and revelation is engaging culture, and culture is talking back a little bit to that revelation side, that we need to take seriously aspects of our created being, that biology, science, technology, all of these things are important. And we do have developments within this cultural sphere. But it doesn't mean that those things should take priority over Scripture or theology. What it means is we have to do the work of interpreting Scripture and articulating our theological beliefs in conversation with the broader culture. And if I could put another word in there, I would simply put the word hermeneutics, that this is a hermeneutical move. We're constantly interpreting. We're interpreting the Bible. We're interpreting theology and giving language to our experiences of who God is. And then we're interpreting culture, and we're trying to make sense of culture. And what practical theology wants to do is bring these interpretations together and ask serious questions then about what does it mean to live as human beings in this world? What does it mean for our faith to guide us in the realm of politics or economics? I think it means taking the political sphere seriously, and we need Christians to study politics and Christians to study economics. It means taking biology and gender studies and all of that very seriously and asking questions about some of the developments in human culture. But we do that in conversation with the revelation of God in Jesus. We do that in conversation with the Bible and with theology. And this is the task of practical theology. Now, I've had some people say to me, well, wait a minute, this is the task of all theology, whether it's scripture, systematics, whatever. And of course it is. But practical theology specifically is asking questions about like pastoral care, Christian education. How do we teach? How do changes in the way that we understand psychological development of young people change the way we think about passing on the faith or the tradition, for example? So in practical theology, it's pushed down into the nitty-gritty of life. And this is where the practical theologian lives. And so people who are going on to be youth pastors, to be pastors, to be educators, to even work in faith-based nonprofits, this is where you hit the nitty-gritty of saying, how do we take the revelation of God in Jesus through Scripture and through the tradition, and how do we bring that into conversation with the broader culture? Now, some language that we want to talk about here when it comes to practical theology is this word praxis. And all of this is a way of trying to articulate that we're not just talking about doing something. What we're talking about is certainly doing something, which we would call practice. But what praxis is trying to get at is that every way of doing something has embedded within it theory. Now, we grow up within a culture and we absorb these things, these practices that have this theory, this form of praxis. We absorb them so we don't have to think about them, or we're not always conscious of them. But what practical theology wants to do is make us conscious of the theory that is embedded within these practices. We want to ask, well, what is actually happening when there's conflict in a family? What's going on here? When there's conflict in a congregation, when a young person is struggling in different areas, we're asking what's happening. We're examining the practices and saying, all right, what's buried underneath here? And how can we develop new forms of praxis, new ways of thinking? And what this focuses on then is reflecting upon practice. So what do we mean by theory? So theory is reflection. What are the beliefs and ideas that form and shape what is happening? And a phrase that I want to use, and this comes from Don Browning and a book that he wrote that has been central to the field of practical theology for a long time. He talks about a thick description, that when we're describing what's happening, we're providing a thick description or theory-laden practices. And that's the task of a practical theologian. So I would make the case that as a youth pastor or as a pastor, when there's conflict in a community, the task then is to take a step back and say, all right, here's what's going on, and then ask some deeper questions about, well, why is this happening? What is going on that is deeper here that we need to be attuned to and deal with? And if we're constantly just skirting the surface, we're never dealing with the underlying issues that need to be dealt with. If I were to change this little photo that I have here, I would go from praxis and theory to new praxis. So what you're doing is you're moving from experience, here's what's happened, you're reflecting upon that, and then through that reflection, you're developing new ways of being. And this goal, or the goal of this, is transformation. You're trying to come up with new forms of practice, new ways that can bring reconciliation between people in a community, in a family, in a church. And that this is the task of a practical theologian. And if you're a youth pastor, a pastor, an educator within the Christian community, you're within this field of practical theology, and you're constantly seeking to bring transformation. One of the things that I want to add to this, and this comes from a guy named Ray Anderson, who taught at Fuller for a long time. And what he does is he wants to talk about Christopraxis, because we know that God is the one who brings transformation. Those of us who are Christians, we believe God is the one who is acting. God is bringing God's kingdom. And in Jesus Christ, God is the one who brings transformation. And so from that perspective, Ray Anderson wants to talk about Christopraxis, that in theology, what we're doing is reflecting upon the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, and God is speaking to us. So any youth pastor, leader in a Christian community has to attune themselves to what God is saying through Scripture. What is God saying in Jesus or through the tradition and the life of the community? But we also then have to take seriously the culture and the human experience. Practical theology is interdisciplinary. It's always taking these different disciplines and it's bringing them together, because we have to take seriously the cultural side and the human side. This is the contextual side of ministry, that we're not doing ministry in a vacuum, and therefore we have to attend to some of these cultural issues that are taking place. So biology, psychology, sexuality, technology, all of these things are things that we have to take seriously. And for Ray Anderson in Christopraxis, what it's saying is we're seeking that transformation in Jesus. So everything that we're doing in reflecting upon what's happening and bringing to bear the revelation of God's grace and love in Jesus, bringing that to bear upon this cultural experience is about transformation. And again, for those of us in the Christian community, the emphasis is on God's transformation and the transformation that is ours in Jesus Christ. Now, another way of thinking about this, and this is really the Don Browning side, is that we're cultivating wisdom. That practical theology is about cultivating a wisdom grounded in the revelation of God in Jesus, but also grounded in the cultural sphere. There's things we need to know as we deal with issues of gender and sexuality and economics. And as a pastor, as a youth pastor, we're not going to be experts necessarily in these fields. But as we address issues, we need to be drawing from resources that help us as we reflect upon, all right, what is really happening here? And so the word that gets used, and this comes out of Aristotle, which is why I have a picture of Aristotle in the background there, is phronesis. It's practical wisdom. We're reflecting upon experience to uncover these theory-laden practices. It's interdisciplinary, so we're taking the revelation of God in Jesus and bringing it together with these different disciplines. So people who study at college take a core curriculum. They're learning about social sciences and the natural sciences and all of these different things. And so in faith-based institutions, the importance of those things is so that we can draw from that knowledge so that we can cultivate a wisdom. And this is the same thing as we think about leadership in the Christian community. Now, we also talk in practical theology, we talk about the arts of ministry, that ministry is an art. And I like that term art because I think sometimes we can move into a hyper-practical perspective and just think everything is technical. Like if I do this, this, and this, then this. And that's not always the case. Dealing with human beings, you're dealing with the mystery of the other person. And so it's an art form. And I think if we thought a little bit more deeply about the poetic nature of ministry, it would go better with us. But as we think about the arts of ministry, we're dealing here with pastoral care. How do we provide pastoral care, drawing from revelation, but also cultivating the tools of counseling and psychology and so on? Preaching, worship leading, Christian education, counseling, teaching, youth ministry, and we can add a whole bunch more. But these are the arts. These are the things that we develop, and these are the things that we do. But when we recognize them as art, what we're doing is we're constantly asking questions. We're drawing from the tradition, the Christian tradition, the faith tradition, but we're also taking seriously the different creational aspects of the world that we're engaged in. These are not just techniques. And I think seeing them as the arts of ministry helps us remember that. So one of the things I want to leave you with here is something by Richard Osmer. He talks about the 4 tasks of practical theology, and we're going to keep coming back to these 4 tasks. And I'm just going to quickly go through them now and briefly describe them because we're going to keep coming back to this. And I think that for those of us in ministry, this provides, I think, an important foundation for us to think about how to address any particular experience or issue in our community. So the first task is the descriptive empirical task. You're basically asking the question, what's going on? You're gathering information and you're discerning patterns and dynamics. The interpretive task then is, well, why is this going on? And then you're drawing from theories to try to help explain what's going on. What are the patterns and what are the dynamics at work as we try to make sense of what is happening? Again, getting at the theory-laden practices. And the normative task, and I understand that this can get a little dicey. Some people aren't so sure we should talk about the ought. But what he means is, in thinking about a community, like what should be happening? How should we treat one another? And thinking about that from a Christian perspective, how do we deal with conflict? So what should be happening? How should people be dealing with their differences? And so it's in this normative task that we draw from the tradition of Scripture, theology, and so on to make sense of, all right, how can we bring transformation? How can we bring reconciliation into this? And then the pragmatic task is where now we give a response and we're saying, here's a way forward. Here's a new form of praxis that we can do within the community to help address some of these problems or some of the conflict or whatever's going on in the life of an individual person. And again, these tasks to me are foundational to what it means to do pastoral care, what it means to do ministry. And my hope is that at some point, these 4 tasks just become embedded. It just becomes natural that when something happens in the community, we take a step back and we move through these different tasks and we begin asking these questions. What's going on? Why is it going on? What ought to be going on? And now how do we respond? And I think when we do this, it provides important tools for us to move our communities to the transformation that we seek. And it's the transformation that comes in Jesus, and that is central. God is at work, but God works through us. And God chooses to work through us, using us to become conduits of grace, mercy, and transformation.